It was the dawn of a restless year, 1775. The air in the 13 American colonies carried a strange unease, like the calm before a storm. For decades, the colonists had toiled, farmed, traded, and built their lives from the ground up. They had faced wild frontiers, harsh winters, and endless wars, and yet what angered them most was not nature, but their own rulers an ocean away. Across the Atlantic in London sat the British Parliament, a place where decisions were made about American lives, but no American had a voice. The colonies were treated as subjects, not citizens. They were expected to pay taxes, heavy, unfair, and unending, and to fill the coffers of the British Crown. Tea, paper, sugar, stamps, everything that touched daily life was taxed. But when the colonists demanded to be heard, they were silenced. When they asked for representation, they were told to obey. And that's when a new phrase echoed through the towns, the markets, the taverns: no taxation without representation. That single line became more than a slogan. It became the spark. Boston, a city that had seen both trade and tyranny, turned into the beating heart of rebellion. Its narrow streets, lined with cobblestones and old lamps, began to whisper secrets of freedom. People gathered in taverns late at night, whispering about resistance, about unity, about breaking the chains of a distant king. They weren't soldiers, not yet. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, sailors, ordinary people with extraordinary courage. Every unfair law passed by Britain added fuel to the fire. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each one deepened the wound. The final insult came in 1773, when British ships carrying taxed tea arrived in Boston Harbor. The colonists had warned them, no tax without consent, but the British refused to listen. And then came the night that changed everything. December 16th, 1773, a freezing winter evening. A group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ships and began dumping chests of tea into the dark, icy waters of the harbor. One by one, 342 chests sank beneath the waves. The Boston Tea Party had begun. For the British Crown, it was an act of treason. For the colonies, it was a declaration: we will not be slaves. The British response was swift and cruel. They shut down Boston's harbor, cut off trade, and sent thousands of red-coated soldiers to enforce control. But what King George III didn't understand was that he had just awakened something far greater: the American spirit. In the spring of 1775, the colonies began to unite like never before. From Virginia to Massachusetts, from New York to the Carolinas, men and women began to whisper one word: freedom. Meetings were held in secret barns and candle-lit rooms. Leaders like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, and Benjamin Franklin began to speak of a future without kings. "Give me liberty or give me death," Patrick Henry had said in Virginia, and those words traveled across every colony like a thunderclap. Tension was rising fast. British General Thomas Gage, stationed in Boston, received orders to crush the growing rebellion before it could spread. He sent his spies into towns to identify the leaders and weapons. But what he didn't realize, the Americans were already watching him too. Every move of the British Army was being reported by local writers, blacksmiths, and farmers. And by April, the news arrived. The British were marching to seize weapons stored in a small town called Concord. That night, the signal went out: the British are coming. A lone rider named Paul Revere galloped through the dark countryside under the moonlight, his horse's hooves thundering against the dirt road. From village to village, he shouted, "The British are coming! To arms, to arms!" Doors flew open, lanterns lit, and men grabbed their muskets. By dawn, in the quiet town of Lexington, 70 American militiamen, farmers, fathers and sons, stood on the green field, their hearts pounding. Across them stood the mighty British redcoats, trained soldiers, disciplined and deadly. No one knows who fired the first shot, but when it rang out, history changed forever. The shot heard round the world, man, that's what it would later be called. Smoke filled the air. Chaos erupted. The British fired. The Americans fired back. When the dust settled, 8 colonists lay dead, but their sacrifice was not in vain. It was the beginning of something unstoppable. As the British continued to conquer, they found themselves ambushed again and again. From behind trees, fences, and barns, American militiamen fired relentlessly. They weren't fighting like a traditional army. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. The mighty British forces, who once believed they could crush rebellion in a single day, found themselves retreating back to Boston under constant fire. It was a humiliation. The word spread quickly. The colonies had fought back, and with that the American Revolution had truly begun. In towns and cities across the colonies, church bells rang. Men kissed their wives goodbye and marched off to join local militias. Women melted down their silver to make bullets. Blacksmiths forged bayonets and muskets. Even young boys carried water and food to the fighters. The colonies were no longer just subjects of the crown. They were now revolutionaries. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress gathered once again. The tension inside the hall was electric. The question was no longer if they would fight, but how they would win. Some still hoped for peace, but most knew that peace was no longer possible. Blood had been spilled and the world had changed. The delegates voted to form a Continental Army, a united military force for all 13 colonies. And to lead it, they chose a tall, dignified man from Virginia, dressed in a modest blue uniform, George Washington. He rose to his feet, thanked them for their trust, and with quiet humility said, "I will accept this command, though I fear my abilities may not be equal to it. But I shall devote every power I possess to our country's cause." Outside, as he rode off to take command of the new army, people lined the streets to see him. Some waved flags, others whispered prayers. For the first time, the colonies had a leader, and a reason to believe. Back in Boston, the British Army fortified its positions, unaware that their hold over America was slipping faster than they imagined. Across the countryside, the revolution was spreading like wildfire. Ordinary farmers were becoming soldiers. Town squares were turning into training camps, and every beating heart carried the same dream: freedom. The roads that once carried British trade now carried American resistance. The ships that once brought goods now brought soldiers. The tea that once symbolized comfort now symbolized oppression. It was no longer about taxes or trade or even politics. It was about dignity, about a people deciding they would no longer bow to a king who did not know their names. And so, as the spring of 1775 turned to summer, America stood on the edge of something unimaginable, a war not just for land, but for identity. The flames of revolution burned brightest in Boston, but their light reached every corner of the colonies. Farmers sharpened their plows into weapons, blacksmiths forged iron into bayonets, and in the hearts of millions, one belief had taken root: that freedom was worth any price. No one knew how long the struggle would last, or how many lives it would claim. But one thing was certain: the first seeds of independence had been sown, and there was no turning back. The world had just witnessed the birth of rebellion, and soon it would witness the birth of a nation. The morning of April 19, 1775, rose like any other day, quiet, pale, and uncertain. But by sunrise that quiet would be shattered by thunder. The British Army, nearly 700 red-coated soldiers under Major John Pitcairn, marched out of Boston under strict orders: capture the colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, and seize the hidden weapons stored in Concord. They marched in silence, their muskets gleaming, boots striking rhythmically against the dirt road. To the British it was a simple mission. To the Americans it was destiny knocking. Along the countryside the alarm riders had done their work. Bells rang in distant churches, horns blew through sleeping villages, and men rushed from their homes pulling on coats, grabbing powder horns and muskets. From every direction farmers and townsmen gathered, men who had never fought a war before, but who refused to let their land be taken. At Lexington Green, as dawn's first light touched the horizon, 77 militiamen stood waiting. Their leader, Captain John Parker, was an aging farmer who had fought in earlier wars. His voice trembled not with fear but conviction as he told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Moments later, the British column appeared, redcoats blazing against the soft morning mist. Major Pitcairn shouted, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world held its breath. And then a twist shot. No one knew who fired first. Some said it came from the British ranks, others from behind a fence. But that single spark unleashed the storm. The air exploded with smoke and gunfire. Muskets cracked. Men screamed. The green filled with chaos. The smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded, the pounding of boots. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, 10 more wounded. The British cheered and marched onward toward Concord, thinking they had crushed the rebellion before it began. But what they didn't know, the true fight was just beginning. As the Redcoats reached Concord's North Bridge, they found something unexpected. Hundreds of militiamen had gathered, watching from the hills and fields. The colonists were no longer disorganized farmers. They were brothers in arms. When the British began to burn supplies in the town, smoke rose into the sky, and that sight broke something inside the Americans. The militiamen advanced. They fired, the British fired back. For the first time, the British troops, who were the most powerful army in the world, began to fall. And then came the order that would change history: fire for liberty. The crack of muskets echoed through the hills, and British soldiers stumbled backward, shocked that these colonists dared to fight, and fight well. Within hours, the mighty Redcoats began their retreat back to Boston, marching through miles of open countryside. But the road home became a nightmare. Every hill, every tree, every stone wall hid an American with a musket. From behind fences, barns, and rocks they fired and vanished. The Redcoats were trapped in a deadly gauntlet. The colonists didn't fight in neat lines like European armies. They fought like ghosts of the forest, appearing and disappearing with deadly precision. For miles, the British bled. Their soldiers collapsed in exhaustion and fear. By the time they finally staggered back into Boston, nearly 300 were dead or wounded. That day, the world witnessed something extraordinary. A new kind of soldier had been born. Not a king's soldier, but a citizen soldier, a man who fought not for pay, but for purpose. Word of the battle spread like wildfire. From colony to colony, news riders galloped through villages shouting, "Lexington! Concord, the war has begun." Bells rang, crowds gathered, and within days, thousands of men were marching toward Boston, volunteers, ready to fight for a cause bigger than themselves. The British commander, General Gage, soon found his army surrounded. Tens of thousands of colonial militia formed a massive ring around Boston, cutting off every escape, and within that siege, new leaders began to emerge, men whose names would echo through history: George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, Israel Putnam, and Henry Knox. But for now, in those first few weeks, the fighting spirit came from ordinary hearts. There were stories that defined the courage of that moment, like Samuel Whittemore, a 78-year-old farmer who stood alone on the road with his musket as the British advanced. He shot 3 soldiers before being shot himself, in the face, the neck, and the arm. Yet somehow he lived. When asked later why he fought, he simply said, "Because it was my duty." Or the story of the women who melted their pewter plates to make musket balls, who baked bread for soldiers, who sent their sons to war with prayers and tears. For every musket the colonists fired, the British fired 10. For every cannon the British rolled out, the colonists had none. Yet they stood. In London, when news of Lexington and Concord reached King George III, he was furious. He called the colonists traitors and vowed to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. Parliament cheered him on. They were certain America would fall within months. But across the ocean in the colonies, the spirit of freedom was rising like a tide. The colonial militias soon began to organize under one banner: the Continental Army. And though they lacked uniforms, money, and even shoes, they had something no empire could buy: belief. In the makeshift camps outside Boston, farmers stood beside blacksmiths, carpenters beside merchants. They practiced drilling, loading, marching, learning the art of war while the smoke of their homes still hung in the air. Each day they trained harder. Each night they whispered to each other, "We will be free." Meanwhile, inside Boston, the British soldiers found themselves trapped. Supplies were running short, morale was breaking. They held the city, but not the hearts of the people. Outside the walls, the Americans waited, patient, determined. By June 1775, the next great test came. The Battle of Bunker Hill. Though technically fought on Breed's Hill, it became one of the most legendary moments of the Revolution. Thousands of British soldiers advanced up the hill, bayonets fixed, confident of victory. At the top stood about 1,500 American militiamen with almost no ammunition. Their leader, Colonel William Prescott, gave a command that would become immortal. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British marched closer. The Americans held their ground, and when the enemy was close enough, the colonists unleashed a storm of fire. Rows of British soldiers fell, the air filled with smoke and screams. Twice the British charged, and twice they were driven back. Only when the Americans ran out of gunpowder did the Redcoats finally take the hill. It was technically a British victory, but the cost was staggering. More than 1,000 of their men were killed or wounded. The colonists had lost the hill, but they had won something greater: respect. From that day, the British Army realized they were not fighting peasants. They were fighting patriots.
The battle hardened the resolve of the colonies, and when word reached the newly appointed commander, George Washington, he said simply, "The liberty we prize is not the gift of the king. It is the birthright of mankind." That belief carried his soldiers through hunger, fear, and endless nights of uncertainty. Every musket fired at Lexington, every step taken at Concord, every drop of blood spilled on Bunker Hill, all of it was the beginning of the American soul. For the first time, the colonists were no longer thinking of themselves as British subjects. They were Americans, people united not by geography, but by a dream. And that dream was spreading faster than any army could march. In every colony, people gathered in courthouses and meeting halls, signing pledges of resistance. Printers published pamphlets calling for independence. The most famous of them all, written by a man named Thomas Paine, declared, "These are the times that try men's souls." He was right. The path ahead would be brutal. But for those who had seen the first shot and fought the first revenge, there was no going back. They had already made their choice: liberty or death. The world had changed forever on that April morning in 1775, and though the British still held their flags high, the truth was clear to anyone who dared look beyond the smoke. The sun of freedom had begun to rise over America, and soon, under the leadership of a man named George Washington, that sunrise would become a blazing light that no empire could ever extinguish.
The summer of 1775 burned hot across the 13 colonies, but the fire that truly blazed was not in the fields. It was in the hearts of men. The blood of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill had changed everything. What had begun as a protest was now a war. The question was no longer if the colonies would fight, but who would lead them. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress gathered once again in a sweltering hall filled with tension and hope. The delegates knew they needed one man, someone strong enough to unite the colonies, wise enough to command respect, and brave enough to stand against the greatest empire on earth. All eyes turned to one figure. He stood tall and calm, dressed not in the polished red of a British officer, but in the modest blue of a Virginian colonel. His gray eyes carried quiet strength, and though he spoke little, his presence filled the room. His name was George Washington. When John Adams rose and nominated him as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, the room fell silent. Washington, humble as ever, stood and said, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with, but since it is the voice of my country, I will devote every power I possess to her service." That moment marked the birth of America's first army, and its first true leader. Washington left Philadelphia on horseback, riding north to take command of the troops gathered outside Boston. As he traveled through towns, people came out to watch. Farmers paused their work. Mothers lifted their children high to see him. They had never seen a general like him, not a man of privilege or cruelty, but one of integrity. When Washington arrived at Cambridge in July 1775, what he saw was far from an army. Thousands of men stood in ragged clothes, some with no shoes, many without muskets. They were brave, yes, but disorganized. Farmers and fishermen, shopkeepers and blacksmiths, all camped together under the hot sun, sleeping in tents made of rags. Still, when Washington rode through their lines on his white horse, every man stood tall. The sight of him brought order to chaos. He spent his first weeks inspecting every regiment, every weapon, every store of powder. He set rules, trained men, and demanded discipline. The Continental Army was born not from wealth or experience, but from Washington's unshakable will. Each night, as fires flickered across the camp, Washington would sit inside his tent, writing letters by candlelight and to Congress, to his officers, to anyone who would listen. His greatest enemy was not Britain but supply. His men lacked food, medicine, gunpowder, and even blankets. And yet he never let despair show. He wrote, "We must make the best of what we have and trust that heaven will crown our cause with success." Across the river in Boston, British General Thomas Gage looked out from his fortress walls. He had thousands of well-trained troops, ships in the harbor, and enough supplies to last months. He believed the Americans would break easily. But he underestimated Washington and the people behind him. Through the fall and winter of 1775, Washington's army surrounded Boston in a siege. Neither side dared a full assault. Instead, both watched and waited. Washington trained, planned, and hoped for one miracle: cannon. That miracle came from a young Boston bookseller turned artillery genius, Henry Knox. He volunteered for an impossible mission: to haul 59 massive cannons from Fort Ticonderoga in New York all the way to Boston, across frozen rivers, snow-covered mountains, and wilderness. It took him nearly 2 months, but by February 1776 he did it. Washington could hardly believe it when he saw the guns rolling into camp, their iron barrels glinting in the winter sun. In the dead of night on March 4th, Washington ordered his men to move. They dragged the cannons to the top of Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. When the British awoke the next morning, they were stunned. The Americans now had heavy artillery aimed directly at their ships. General Gage realized he had no choice. Within days, the British Army and Navy evacuated Boston. The city that had been under enemy control for years was free. When Washington rode through the cheering streets, people waved flags and threw flowers. Bells rang. Men cried. For the first time, America had won. Not just a battle, but hope. But that victory was only the beginning. The British crown was furious.
King George III declared that the colonies were in open rebellion and sent a massive force, 32,000 soldiers,
10,000 sailors, and hundreds of ships, the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas. Their target, New York. Washington knew the storm was coming. He marched his army south to defend the city, but he also knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and inexperienced. Still, he told his men, "We must resolve to conquer or die." By the summer of 1776, the war had taken a new turn. While Washington prepared for battle, the Continental Congress took the boldest step in history, declaring independence. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Its words, written by Thomas Jefferson and signed by men who knew the price of treason, declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." When Washington read those words aloud to his troops in New York, silence fell. Some men wept. Others cheered. For the first time, they were not fighting to protest British laws. They were fighting to create a nation. But freedom came with a heavy cost. In August 1776, the British landed on Long Island with overwhelming force. Washington's army, still untrained, was crushed in a brutal battle. Dozens died, hundreds were captured. Smoke rose over Brooklyn as the American army faced total annihilation. But Washington refused to surrender. In one of the most daring moves of the war, he ordered a nighttime evacuation across the East River. Under thick fog and total silence, his men rowed small boats back to Manhattan, right past the British fleet. When morning came, not a single American soldier remained. The entire army had escaped. That miraculous retreat saved the revolution. Yet the following months were dark. Washington's army was chased across New Jersey, beaten, starving, freezing. Desertion was rampant. Congress fled Philadelphia, fearing capture. The dream of freedom seemed to be dying before it had even begun. By December 1776, only a few thousand men remained with Washington, barefoot, hungry, wrapped in rags. Their footprints left blood in the snow. Standing by the icy Delaware River, Washington looked at his weary men and saw something beyond weakness. He saw faith. Faith in him, faith in the cause, faith that somehow This nation could be born through pain. And so, on Christmas night, he made his boldest decision yet. While the British celebrated the holiday, Washington and his men silently crossed the frozen river in small boats. Icy wind cut through their coats, ice formed in their hair, but they rowed on. Many couldn't swim, and one wrong move would mean death. But they pressed forward. Before dawn, they reached Trenton, New Jersey, and struck like lightning. The British allied Hessian troops, still half asleep, were taken completely by surprise. Within an hour, the Americans captured nearly 1,000 enemies with minimal losses. It was a victory so small in size, yet so massive in spirit. Washington's name became legend. The soldiers who had once doubted now believed. The colonies that had feared now found courage. And across the ocean in London, for the first time, fear began to grow. In the months that followed, Washington continued his campaign with renewed purpose. At Princeton, he rode through cannon fire to rally his men, shouting, "Stand fast! The victory is ours!" His courage was not born from arrogance, but from destiny. By 1777, Washington was no longer just a general. He was the heart of a nation, yet he was not without pain. He saw friends fall in battle, letters filled with pleas for food unanswered, winters so cold that men froze beside campfires. But even then, he never gave up. He wrote to Congress, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend under God on the courage and conduct of this army." Each defeat only strengthened his resolve. Each hardship shaped him into the leader history would remember, not for how many battles he won, but for how he never surrendered. By the time the year ended, the colonies had not only found a commander, they had found their symbol, George Washington, the man who stood tall when others bent, who carried hope through defeat, who turned rebellion into revolution, had risen. And though darker days lay ahead, though winter would soon bring hunger and despair at a place called Valley Forge, the fire within him and within America would never die, because by now, the revolution was no longer a fight for land. It was a fight for identity, for freedom, for the right of every human being to choose their destiny. And at the center of it all rode one man, steady, silent, unbreakable, George Washington, the father of a nation yet to be born. The year was 1781. The war had raged on for 6 long, exhausting years. The American colonies had endured hunger, losses, betrayal, and endless battles. Villages had burned, families had suffered, and yet hope refused to die. Every farmer, every blacksmith, every soldier who had taken up arms against the might of the British Empire still whispered the same word: freedom. George Washington stood at the edge of the camp in Yorktown, Virginia, the cold evening wind brushing against his coat. His eyes were fixed on the distant fires of the British camp. General Charles Cornwallis, commander of the British forces, was inside that camp, confident that his army's discipline and training would crush the weary Americans once and for all. But this time, Washington had something that changed everything: unity and allies. The French alliance had finally paid off. French warships had entered American waters under Admiral de Grasse, cutting off British naval supply lines. On land, French troops led by General Rochambeau joined forces with Washington's Continental Army. For the first time in this entire war, the American army was not just fighting for survival, it was fighting to win. The plan was bold. Washington deceived the British by pretending to attack New York, while secretly marching his troops hundreds of miles south toward Yorktown. Thousands of soldiers moved silently through forests and muddy roads, carrying cannons, wagons, and dreams of victory. The people along the route watched with tears of pride. They knew this march could change history forever. By September 1781, Yorktown was surrounded. British ships could not approach. French cannons dominated the sea. On land, American and French forces closed in, digging trenches closer and closer to the British defenses every night. Cannonballs screamed through the air as both sides exchanged fire. Smoke filled the sky. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the autumn wind. Washington's men worked day and night, building fortifications, dragging artillery into position. In the middle of the chaos, young American soldiers wrote letters to their families. "If I fall, tell them I died free." Inside the British camp, supplies were running low. Food was scarce. Morale was breaking. Cornwallis realized he was trapped. Then came October 9th, 1781. At sunrise, the first American cannon roared. The bombardment began. Dozens of cannons opened fire at once, shaking the ground like thunder. French artillery joined in. The sky lit up with flames as cannonballs tore through British walls and tents. For 8 days and nights, the bombardment never stopped. Every explosion brought the Americans one step closer to victory. Among Washington's officers, there was a sense of destiny. They knew the war could end here. The Continental Army advanced, capturing British redoubts one by one. The assault on Redoubt 10, led by Alexander Hamilton, became legendary. As night fell, Hamilton and his men charged through British fire, bayonets gleaming. No gunshots, no retreat, only courage. They stormed the fort and captured it in minutes. When Washington received the news, he simply nodded, knowing the end was near. Inside his tent, Cornwallis wrote a desperate letter to London. He asked for reinforcements, but none could come. The British Navy, once unmatched, had been blocked by the French fleet. The empire that ruled the oceans now stood helpless on the shores of Virginia. On October 17th, a white flag appeared from the British camp. Silence fell across the battlefield. The cannon fire stopped. Cornwallis had surrendered. 2 days later, under a gray sky, the British troops marched out of Yorktown with their drums beating a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a song of disbelief, because indeed the world had changed. The most powerful empire on earth had been defeated by farmers, blacksmiths, and dreamers. As the British soldiers laid down their arms, the American and French forces stood in quiet respect. Washington watched, his face calm but his heart heavy with emotion. This was not just a military victory. It was the birth of a nation. The news spread like wildfire across the colonies. Church bells rang, people danced in the streets, and tears of joy rolled down faces that had known only struggle. Mothers hugged their sons returning from the front. Farmers raised the new American flag above their barns. The dream that began in Boston, that echoed through Lexington, Concord, and Valley Forge, had finally come true. But even in celebration, Washington remained cautious. He knew the war was not officially over. Britain had not yet signed any treaty. Negotiations would take time, and soldiers still stood ready across America. The following 2 years were filled with diplomacy, as representatives met in Paris to discuss peace. Then, in 1783, the moment came. The Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States of America. The signatures on that paper were more than ink. They were the promise of a new world. For the first time in history, a group of colonies had overthrown their empire and built a republic based on liberty. Across the ocean, the British Parliament sat in silence. They had underestimated the spirit of a people who refused to bow. They had learned that no empire, no matter how vast, can suppress the will of those who fight for freedom. Back in America, George Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon. He could have become a king, a ruler, a man of absolute power. But he refused. He laid down his sword and said, "The power is in the hands of the people." That single act defined what the new America would be. A land not ruled by kings, but by citizens. Years later, when the Constitution was written and the first government formed, people remembered the winter at Valley Forge, the march to Yorktown, and the courage that built a nation from dust and dreams. The flag that once flew over rebel camps now waved proudly over free cities. The revolution had ended, but its message had just begun. The idea that ordinary men and women could stand up to tyranny and shape their own destiny spread across the world. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to South America, people began to whisper the same word: freedom. And thus, out of the smoke of battle, the United States of America was born, a nation not perfect but full of promise, a land built not on bloodlines or crowns, but on belief, and belief that all men are created equal, that liberty is worth any price, and that hope can survive even in the darkest of wars. As the sun set over Yorktown that evening, Washington stood quietly on the hill. The sound of drums had faded, the cannons were silent, and the stars began to appear above. He looked at the horizon, the same horizon where once the British ships had ruled. Now it was peaceful. Now it was free. He whispered to himself, "We have done it." For generations yet unborn, And with that, he turned back toward his camp, knowing that history had changed forever. The American Revolution, a story of courage, unity, and sacrifice, from rebellion to victory, from oppression to independence. It was not just a war for land, but a war for the soul of mankind. This was the story of those who refused to kneel. This was the story of freedom itself. This was the story of the United States of America.